In a poor town, a single black mother struggled to survive each day, carrying her frail, heart-sick son on her back. One cold afternoon, she unexpectedly came across a lost old man, hungry, weak, and wearing nothing but a pair of torn socks. Though she had almost nothing left, she welcomed him into her home with quiet compassion. What she didn't know was that the man was a wealthy billionaire, and her simple act of kindness would change all of their lives forever. It was the kind of town people forgot, a place where autumn wasn't gold and romantic, but brittle and gray. The cracked sidewalks of Willow's End were littered with dry leaves, cigarette butts, and old flyers that curled like tired hands. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds that hadn't wept in days. Street lamps flickered even in daylight, not from charm but neglect. Folks moved quickly here, not because they were busy, but because they didn't want to be caught looking at suffering, at poverty, at people who didn't fit. On this particular afternoon, a woman walked past the corner store, gripping her purse tighter when she saw Grace. A man coming out of the diner took one look and stepped off the curb, choosing the puddle over proximity. A teenager at the gas station spat near her feet. No one said it out loud, but it was clear she didn't belong. Not her, not her skin, not her son. Grace was 32, though her shoulders bore years far heavier. Her hair, short, tight coils, was tied back beneath a thin scarf. Her jeans were worn at the knees, and her coat had patches she'd sewn by hand. She moved with purpose, but there was fatigue in the way she breathed, as if each inhale had to pass through layers of disappointment. On her back, held in a cloth sling, was Micah, her 8-year-old son. He was small for his age, his cheeks a little too pale, his arms too thin. He blinked slowly, head resting against her neck, his breaths shallow but steady. Micah had been born with a bad heart, the kind that kept him from running, from playing, from growing the way he should. Grace never left him. She couldn't. He didn't have the strength to keep up with other kids, so she carried him. Always. Through job lines, food pantries, clinics, and now through this disinterested town, searching for anything that could help them last another day. They had been turned away again, this time by a cleaning service that wasn't hiring colored girls, even though the sign said help wanted. The manager didn't flinch when he said it, didn't even lower his voice. Grace had simply nodded and walked away, too tired to protest, too proud to beg. She sat down on a bus bench outside an abandoned pharmacy, gently adjusting Micah's position so his weight didn't press on her sore hip. He stirred but didn't wake. Grace's eyes scanned the street, not for danger, but for signs of kindness. She found none. But then she noticed him. A man. Elderly, maybe mid-60s, though life had carved deep lines into his face, making it hard to tell. He wore a wool coat, creased and dusty, but buttoned all the way up, like someone who still remembered dignity. His pants were too big at the waist, cinched with a rope, but it was his feet that caught her breath. He wore socks, only socks, torn, threadbare, stained with old blood and new dirt. He walked without shoes, circling the same block over and over, like a man chasing something he'd forgotten. People passed him and looked away. A woman at the crosswalk wrinkled her nose. A clerk inside the convenience store leaned to lock the door as he came near. A child pointed and was scolded. No one spoke to him. No one asked. Grace watched him stumble slightly as he turned the corner, his knees buckling just for a second. She looked down at Micah, then back at the man. Her own feet ached, her stomach cramped with hunger. She had no work, no food left at home, except maybe half a packet of dry rice. Still, she stood up. She pulled Micah gently closer, tightening the wrap around her shoulders. Her legs screamed from walking all morning, but she crossed the street anyway, stepping into the path of the man who had nowhere to go. "Sir?" she asked softly, stopping just in front of him. The man blinked. His lips moved, but no words came out. His eyes were cloudy, distant. He looked past her, around her, through her. Grace reached out, not to touch, but to steady the space between them. "Are you all right?" He blinked again. "I don't know," he said. His voice was cracked, as if it hadn't been used in days. That was enough. She turned toward her part of town, her steps slow and deliberate. "Come with me," she said. He hesitated, but she waited. Eventually his feet followed. And so they walked, the three of them, an exhausted mother, a sick child, and a stranger with nothing but socks on his feet, toward the smallest home on the poorest street. The house wasn't really a house, more like a structure that had given up on being anything else, a mix of old wood, plastic sheeting, and siding that might have once been blue. The wind found its way through the seams without asking permission, and the only real door was a slab of plywood Grace had hinged with rust, but it was hers, it was theirs. She led the old man through the front, careful to move slowly so he could follow. He didn't say much. He seemed to forget why he was walking halfway through each step, like every moment required him to relearn how to exist. Grace kept glancing over her shoulder, not to check if he was still behind her. She could hear the dragging of his feet. But to make sure he... Inside, the air was still and cold. The light was soft and yellow, coming from a lamp that flickered every now and then when the wire twisted too far from the battery hookup. She lowered Micah gently onto the rickety table by the wall. He blinked, awake now, but quiet, his thin fingers clutching the edge of the wood. Grace turned to the old man. "You can sit," she said, nodding toward the only chair with all four legs still steady. He hesitated, staring at it like it was unfamiliar. Then slowly he lowered himself down. His hands trembled as they rested in his lap. He looked around, eyes moving across the room, not judging, just lost. She knelt by the box near the wall where she kept their cleanest clothes. Most of what was in there was Micah's, threadbare shirts, one pair of decent pants. At the bottom was a mismatched bundle of fabric, scraps she had sewn together last winter into something that resembled oversized socks. She picked them up, ran her thumb over the seams, and stood. "I know they're not much," she said, gently crouching in front of him, "but they're warmer than what you've got." She reached down and carefully pulled off his filthy socks, stiff with grime and dampness. The skin beneath was cracked and red. She tried not to react, not because she didn't care, but because pity can feel cruel when it leaks out too obviously. She slipped the patchwork socks over his feet, then wrapped the tattered blanket from the couch around his legs. He looked at her, blinking slowly, like she had just done something he hadn't expected another human to do in years. His lips moved. He tried to speak, but nothing came. She nodded, as if to say, "It's all right. You don't have to." Micah's voice, quiet and hoarse, broke the silence. "Are you hungry, mister?" The old man looked at the boy, then at Grace, then nodded. Grace stood, brushing her palms on her jeans, and moved toward the makeshift kitchen in the corner. Really just a propane burner on a metal frame, next to a shelf of salvaged cans and a sack of old rice. She took inventory without words. Half an onion, one soft carrot, a handful of rice, 3 slices of dried sausage that barely counted as meat, and water, of course. She worked in silence. Cut what needed cutting, stirred gently, her back to the room but her ears on it. Behind her the old man coughed softly now and then. Micah asked questions, too many, as he always did with strangers. "What's your name? Do you like soup? Do your knees hurt? You're kind of like Grandpa, but not really." Grace smiled to herself at the sound of him talking. When Micah asked questions, it meant his chest wasn't aching too badly. The soup took 20 minutes. She ladled it into the largest mug they owned and carried it to the old man. "Be careful," she said. "It's hot." He took it in both hands, shaky at first, then more stable as the warmth seeped into his fingers. He drank slowly, like every sip surprised him. Halfway through, color began to return to his cheeks. Just a hint of it, like someone drawing with the lightest pastel. Grace leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him. Not like a nurse or a caretaker, just a woman trying to understand. That night, when it came time to sleep, she walked over to the short cot in the corner. The boards creaked even under her slight weight. She stacked old cushions on top, laid out the thinnest blanket they had, the warmest one they could spare. "You can sleep here," she said softly. He looked at it like it was too much. But he didn't protest. She lifted Micah from the table, wrapped him in her arms, and lowered herself into the torn sofa that dipped in the middle like a sad smile. Micah laid across her lap. She pulled a blanket around them both, one hand resting on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. She stared at the ceiling, listened to the sound of wind crawling through the cracks, listened to the old man's quiet breaths from the corner, the ones that finally sounded steady. She thought about the soup, the socks, the ridiculousness of what she'd just done. She had given everything, literally everything, left in the house to a man she didn't know. But somehow, for the first time in weeks, the room felt full. Not with food, not with heat, but with something that almost felt like dignity. She whispered into Micah's hair, not really to him, just to the silence. Maybe that's what matters more. The morning came quietly, as it always did in the edge of Willow's End. Soft light creeping through broken slats and holes in the patched roof. The air still damp with cold. Grace stirred first, her back sore, neck stiff from a night half sitting, half cradling Micah. The boy had shifted in his sleep, his tiny hand now resting gently on her chest. She glanced at the clock they kept on the crate by the window, still ticking. Still an hour fast. She smiled faintly at that, a small comfort in a life full of crooked truths. She turned toward the cot in the corner. Empty. The blanket was folded neatly. The patchwork socks were gone. The man was gone. A cold knot tightened in her chest. She sat up straighter, easing Micah off her lap onto the couch cushion. Her feet hit the bare floor with a soft thud. "Micah," she whispered. He didn't move. She pressed her palm gently to his chest, counted his heartbeats. Slower than normal, but steady. Good enough. She rose, pulled on her boots without socks, and grabbed the old denim jacket that always hung by the door. Her mind raced. Where would he go? How long ago did he leave? Was he confused again? Lost? A sharp gust pushed against the door as she opened it, morning wind slipping beneath her collar like a warning. The street was mostly empty, a few kids dragging backpacks toward the school down the hill, a man hosing down his cracked sidewalk, not to clean it, just to keep his hands busy. No sign of the old man. She walked quickly, scanning the intersections, the alley behind the auto shop, the bus bench they'd sat on the day before. Nothing. No one. She asked at the gas station. The clerk, a man in his 40s with suspicious eyes and a beer belly, shrugged. "You mean the old drunk in the socks?" "Ain't seen him today." The way he said it stung, as if the man hadn't mattered, as if Grace hadn't brought him into her home, fed him with the last food they had, offered him warmth when no one else would. She asked a few more people, but the answers were the same. Blank stares, dismissive waves. One woman even scoffed. "You people always taking in strays. Maybe you should start worrying about your own kid." Grace didn't reply. She just turned and kept walking. By the time she returned home, her feet ached and her throat was dry from the cold air. Micah was awake now, curled on the couch with the old book of animal drawings he liked to pretend he could read. He looked up. "Is he coming back?" Grace tried to keep her voice even. "I don't know, baby." That day moved slowly. She cleaned up what little mess had been left, reheated some water to make weak tea, and chewed on the edges of old bread she'd kept wrapped in cloth. Micah was quiet, watching her more than usual. He didn't ask for food, didn't ask to go outside. As if he could feel the strange emptiness in the room, like something important had slipped away in the night. It wasn't until late afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the chill deepened, that it happened. A knock. Not at the door. At the back window. Grace turned quickly, unsure she'd even heard it. Then again, tap, tap. She moved toward it cautiously, pulled back the edge of the curtain. He was there, standing behind the house, near the little fenced patch where nothing grew. Except this time, he wasn't alone. Two men stood beside him, both in tailored suits, one holding a folded coat, the other a phone. The old man, her old man, stood straighter now, still wrapped in that same blanket, but something in his face had changed. She rushed outside, barefoot now, forgetting her shoes in her hurry. "Where were you?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "We looked for you. I thought—" "I'm sorry," he said, voice clearer, firmer. "I didn't know who I was." She stared at him, blinking. "What do you mean?" He lifted his hand, slowly, deliberately, and placed it against his chest. "Harold Ellison," he said, as if the name had just come back to him. "I remembered it this morning. I saw the sign on the street, Ellison & Co. It triggered something." Grace didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. The suited man beside him cleared his throat. "Mr. Ellison's family's been looking for him. He's been missing 3 days. He wandered off from the estate. Early-stage Alzheimer's. It's not the first time, but this is the farthest he's ever gone." Harold looked at her again, eyes suddenly wet. "I didn't know my name yesterday. I didn't know what I had. But I knew I was cold. I knew I was hungry. And I knew, when you looked at me, you didn't see trash." She felt something twist inside her chest, sharp and confusing. Gratitude, shock, fear that she'd never see him again, all of it tangled into something too big for words. "I left before the sun rose," he continued, "because I thought I needed to go home. But as soon as I got there, it didn't feel like home at all. It felt like marble and space and silence. That place has chandeliers, Grace, but not one soul who'd feed a stranger soup." Her name in his mouth startled her. He must have asked someone. Remembered. He reached into his coat, pulled something out. Her patched socks. Folded, clean. "I told them not to wash them," he said quietly. "They kept me warm. They reminded me what mattered." Grace stood there, arms wrapped around herself, unsure what world she had stepped into. She glanced at the men behind him, then at Harold again. "So what happens now?" But Harold only smiled. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "But I know where I want to start." The sun had long disappeared by the time Grace bolted the door for the night. Outside, the wind moaned through the power lines, rattling the loose panel on the roof like it always did when the cold crept in deep. Inside, the air was still and dim, lit only by the flickering lantern balanced on a crate near the couch. Micah had fallen asleep, curled under the second-hand quilt, one small hand still clinging to the corner like it was his anchor in a world that changed too fast. Grace sat in the quiet, a chipped mug of hot water between her palms, staring at the steam and letting her thoughts circle endlessly like moths around a bulb. Harold Ellison. Even now, the name didn't feel real in her mouth. That morning she had gone to bed thinking she'd offered help to a man barely holding onto his mind. She'd woken up to find he'd held onto far more than that. A name, a legacy, a life so distant from hers it felt like a story someone else had made up. But he had come back, not to show off, not to say thank you and vanish behind velvet curtains, but to speak her name, to return her patched socks as if they meant more than all the suits in his closet. She had seen the sincerity in his eyes, the ache, the loneliness. Still, hours later he hadn't returned, and a part of her wondered if maybe that brief moment had been all there was meant to be, a strange, fleeting connection in a world that liked to keep people in their place. She reached to turn off the lantern, ready to surrender to the darkness, when someone knocked. Not once, not hurried. 3 firm knocks, measured, intentional. Her heart jumped. She wasn't used to visitors, especially not after dark. For one horrible moment, she thought someone might be there to take Micah. Her mind spun into old memories. Courthouses, doctors, people asking if she was fit to raise a child with so little to give. She stood, moved quietly across the creaky floor, and looked through the small gap in the curtain. Headlights. A black car parked just off the gravel drive, a figure standing alone on the porch. Tall. Still. She opened the door. There he was. Harold. But not the version from the day before. Not the man with sunken cheeks and a blanket wrapped like armor. This man wore a dark overcoat, neatly buttoned, with a scarf tucked at the collar. His face was freshly shaven, and though the age still sat in his bones, he carried himself like someone who had found his footing again. "Good evening," he said softly. He stepped back without a word, and he entered like someone returning home. Not because it was his, but because it felt safe. He looked around the small room, eyes scanning the shadows, the corners, the little pieces of life scattered across worn furniture and crates. He smiled. "Still warm," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Grace closed the door behind him and folded her arms, unsure what to do with all the questions bubbling in her chest. He looked at her, that same softness in his eyes. "I didn't mean to disappear like that," he said. "I was overwhelmed. I knew I had to go back, but the second I walked through those big glass doors, I wanted to turn around and run." She tilted her head. "Then why didn't you?" He stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "Because I needed to remember who I was, to understand what I had lost. I'd been surrounded by wealth for so long, I forgot what it meant to be seen, really seen. And you didn't see a name or a bank account. You saw a man with cold feet and hungry eyes. You gave me something I haven't had in years." Grace's throat tightened. "It was just soup." "No," he said. "It was dignity. You gave without asking for anything. That matters more than you know." She looked away, suddenly overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. Part of her wanted to believe every word. Another part whispered all the usual warnings. People with power always had strings, and she was tired of pulling at strings that led nowhere. But then he knelt down beside the couch and gently moved the edge of the quilt from Micah's sleeping face. He brushed a knuckle lightly across the boy's cheek. "He's a strong one," Harold said, "but I can tell his heart's working harder than it should. I've seen that look before, in my own daughter, before we lost her." The weight of that truth settled between them. Grace's voice was low. "I'm sorry." "I don't want pity," he said. "I want purpose." He stood, turned to her with a resolve that hadn't been in his eyes before. "I've spent years trying to fill my house with things, but it's still empty. And then for a single night, in a room no bigger than my pantry, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Home." Grace's eyes welled before she could stop them. She wiped at her cheek with the sleeve of her jacket. "What are you saying, Harold?" He took a breath. "I want to help, not as charity, as family. Let me take Micah to the best doctors. Let me help you find work that doesn't leave you begging for scraps. Come live with me. I don't have anyone left, and you didn't let me vanish." She stared at him. At the man who had arrived with nothing, who now stood offering everything. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to protect Micah from another year of hospital wait lists and medicine they could barely afford. But more than anything, she wanted to believe that people like Harold could exist without needing anything in return. "I don't need a savior," she whispered. "You don't need saving," he replied. "You just deserve more than surviving." Silence fell again. Outside the wind slowed. The house, for once, didn't creak, and in that stillness something changed. Grace stepped forward and extended her hand, not as a promise, not as surrender, but as a beginning. "All right," she said, "let's figure it out, together." Harold took her hand, warm, steady, and for the first time in years, Grace felt the kind of quiet that doesn't come from emptiness, but from the end of a long, hard noise finally giving way to peace. The first time Grace stepped through the gates of Harold Ellison's estate, Micah's hand was wrapped so tightly around hers she could feel the tremble in his fingers. She didn't blame him. The house looked more like a museum than a home. 2 stories of stone and glass, windows tall as trees, polished doors that gleamed like gold in the morning sun. The gravel beneath her boots was too fine, too pale, the sound of it too soft compared to the hard crunch of cracked sidewalk she was used to. For a moment she hesitated on the steps, eyes sweeping the pristine porch, the trimmed hedges, the kind of silence that felt more like absence than peace. But Harold stood just beyond the threshold, waiting. He didn't gesture for them to come in. He didn't wave or push or rush. He simply opened the door wide and stepped aside, as if to say, "This is yours now, too, if you want it." Micah was the first to move, his small body still fragile but suddenly confident. He tugged her hand, pulling her forward with the quiet urgency only a child could summon. "Mama," he whispered, "they got stairs that shine." She smiled, despite herself. He wasn't wrong. Inside, the house glowed. It wasn't just the polished wood or the soft recessed lighting. It was the warmth, the scent of something baking in a kitchen somewhere far back, the echo of footsteps that didn't sound empty anymore. The first few days were cautious ones. Grace kept her jacket on longer than she needed to. She waited for someone in a crisp uniform to ask what she was doing there. She folded the linens too neatly, apologized too often, but no one scolded, no one corrected. Harold moved through the house with a steadier gait each morning, his eyes clearer, his voice firmer. And always, Micah at his side. They were an odd pair at first, an aging billionaire with a fading memory, and a boy with a heart too weak to play. But they found a rhythm. Grace would wake to the sound of Harold explaining chess rules in the sunroom, while Micah rearranged the pieces just to hear the old man explain them again. She'd find them in the garden, Harold pointing to birds with names only he could remember, Micah nodding solemnly like he was taking notes no one else could see. One evening, she came home from her new job, part-time work at a community center Harold helped rebuild, only to find Micah curled on the couch with a thick, hard-covered book open on his chest and Harold fast asleep beside him, their hands accidentally clasped between pages. She didn't wake them. She just stood there, watching, listening to their breathing, feeling a kind of stillness bloom inside her that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with being home. There were moments, of course, when the past reached for her, when she'd walk into the pantry and remember how many nights she had stood over an empty shelf, wondering how to stretch one can of beans into dinner for two. When Micah coughed too hard and she instinctively reached for a non-existent inhaler before realizing the cabinet now held 6 prescriptions with his name printed clearly, the insurance already paid. Sometimes she flinched when Harold raised his voice, not out of anger, just to call for Micah across the yard, because raised voices used to mean trouble, eviction, rejection. But those moments faded, not because the pain disappeared, but because something stronger took its place. On the first real snow of winter, Grace stood at the window with a cup of coffee warmer than most of the nights they used to sleep through. Outside, Harold was showing Micah how to pack snow into proper balls. He insisted there was a technique. And Micah was laughing, full and bright, cheeks flushed with more than just cold. The boy ran awkwardly but steadily, no longer needing to be carried. Not afraid. His heart would give out after 2 steps. The surgery had gone well. The recovery was better than anyone expected. Grace watched as Harold slipped slightly on the ice and landed on his knees. Micah squealed and threw a snowball that barely reached his grandfather's chest, but Harold reacted with theatrical shock, falling back with a dramatic groan. Micah doubled over, laughing. And then he turned, looked up at the window, found her. He waved, both hands, like she was a queen behind glass. She waved back, smiling. Then Harold looked up too, eyes meeting hers, and he didn't wave. He just nodded. The kind of nod that says, "We're all right now, you can rest." That night, after dinner, after dishes and stories and a game of dominoes that ended in chaos, Grace sat with Harold in the living room. The fire crackled gently. Micah had fallen asleep between them, wrapped in the same quilt they brought from the old house. She looked over at the man who had once wandered into her life with nothing but 2 torn socks and confusion in his eyes. He looked older now, in a different way, not weaker, just more human. "You okay?" she asked. Harold took a breath. "I don't know how much time I've got left with all my memories intact. Some mornings I wake up and forget what year it is. But I remember you. I remember Micah. And that's enough." Grace nodded slowly. "You don't have to remember everything. We'll be here to remind you." He smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the corners of the eyes. "You gave me a night's rest. I owe you the rest of mine." She didn't reply. She just leaned back, closed her eyes, and let the fire warm her face. The house wasn't quiet. There was the ticking of the clock, the rustle of Micah's breath, the occasional settling of the old floorboards. But it wasn't cold anymore. Not the house, not her life, not the space between them. And somewhere, beneath all that warmth, a truth settled deep and still. Family is not always made by blood, nor measured by history. It's made in the moments when strangers choose to see each other, hold each other, and stay. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.